A number of factors contributed to the American involvement in Vietnam. Among them, Cold War fears that communist victory in Southeast Asia would lead inevitably to growing communist influence around the world. The belief that North Vietnam was a pawn of the Soviets and Communist Chinese, overconfidence in the ability of U.S. troops to prevent the communist takeover of an ally, and anxiety that withdrawal from Vietnam would result in intense domestic and international political criticism. Presidents John F. Kennedy and, in particular, Lyndon Baines Johnson feared that losing South Vietnam would damage their chances for re-election, weaken support for domestic social programs, and make their party, the Democrats, vulnerable to the charge of being soft on communism. The American government was determined to remain in South Vietnam to prevent its fall to the communists. On the other hand, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, a coalition of communist-led rebel forces in South Vietnam, wanted the U.S. to leave Vietnam, and they wanted South and North Vietnam, which had been divided since 1956, to be reunited. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong strategy was to drag out the war and make it increasingly costly to the United States. They figured that sooner or later, the United States would be forced to withdraw from Vietnam. They were right. American leaders grossly underestimated the tenacity of their North Vietnamese and Viet Cong foes. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were willing to sustain extraordinarily high casualties in order to overthrow the pro-American, anti-communist South Vietnamese government. The United States intervened in Vietnam without appreciating the fact that the Vietnamese people had a strong nationalistic spirit rooted in centuries of resisting outside colonial powers. And in a predominantly Buddhist country, the French-speaking Catholic leaders of South Vietnam were generally viewed as representatives of France, the former colonial power. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were able to capitalize on this nationalistic, anti-Western sentiment and on the war's growing unpopularity in the United States. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in early 1973, and the two nations, North and South Vietnam, were forcefully reunited in 1975 when the North conquered the South.